My name is Cynthia Edwards, as Hillary mentioned, and I coordinate the Southeast Conservation Adaptation Strategy across the 6 LCCs of the Southeast. So I'm going to give an overview this morning and partway through hand it over to Rua to talk more specifically about one of our first products, which is the Southeast Conservation Blueprint version 1.0. So today I'll talk quickly about why SECAS, why we needed it, and what was the driver behind it, some of our progress to date, and a few of the projects that have come out of it, some emerging opportunities across the region, some next steps, just so you can see what we're up to in the next 3 to 6 months, and then provide some options to get engaged. We really are encouraging folks across the Southeast, if they haven't been engaged in some of the LCC activities, to do so, and I'll provide some information on that. So why SECAS? So there's a lot of pressures on the land that supports us in the Southeast. We have a lot of urbanization, and we see a lot of farmland and forest lands going under the concrete to provide housing. This map actually is one of the scariest ones I've seen about the emerging mega regions. It's such a great place to live in the Southeast, hence a lot of people want to live here. So we see a lot of urbanization that's really eating up our natural areas. We've got sea level rise on the Gulf Coast and the Atlantic Coast. This is the highway that comes out of the Isle de Jean-Charles band in southwest Louisiana and they're going to be our first climate refugees in North America. So that's pretty scary when you're talking about moving whole families and not allowing them to rebuild on their lands. We've got fire we want in the Southeast to manage our grasslands and forest lands. So, and that's becoming increasingly difficult, in part due to the urbanization map I showed earlier. We've also got fires we don't want. This is from West Texas last week when they had the wildfires. So those are also becoming issues, of course. And like I mentioned, we do have a great place. The Southeast is a great place to live. In fact, when we had our SECAS coordinators meeting last year, that emerged as a real theme for us. We have a great culture of hunting and fishing. We have access to some beautiful places, beaches and Appalachian streams, and it's a great place to live. So that puts a lot of pressure on our resources. There's large disruptive changes impacting conservation. So you put all those things together and it becomes pretty apparent that if we don't do something, fish and wildlife are going to get the leftovers of what's remaining on the land after all of these other pressures are pushing it. So what back in 2011, the state directors of the 15 states in the Southeast identified the need to develop a vision for fish and wildlife so that we wouldn't just be satisfied with the leftovers after everything else was done. So it was initiated in 2011, the strategy, and we've provided updates at the SEAFWA, the Southeast Association of Fish and Wildlife Agency conferences every year since then. And in 2015, we had a summit at the meeting in Asheville that really re-energized, I guess, the SECAS effort. And I'll talk in a few minutes about what we did last fall. So I want to emphasize a couple things here. The Conservation Adaptation Strategy was initiated by the 15 states in the Southeast. They, led by Ed Carter out of Tennessee, he then invited the federal agencies, the 12 federal agencies that make up the Southeast Natural Resource Leadership Group, or SNRLIG. At that time, the LCCs that many of you are familiar with were just getting underway, and they were identified as sort of the opportunity to get the work done that we would need through this. So that's where the LCCs come in to provide sort of the horsepower to get this vision developed and then begin to do that implementation. It was understood right from the beginning that They wanted coordination with the also at that time new climate science centers, specifically in our region, the Southeast Climate Science Center that's based in Raleigh and the South Central Climate Science Center that's based in Norman, Oklahoma, as well as the Southeast Aquatic Resource Partnership. We wanted to make sure there was a strong linkage to the aquatic resources as well. And then given that the LCCs in the Southeast are all self-directed partnerships, that also provides an opportunity to broaden that work through a bigger network of partners and sectors. So we'll touch on that again in a few minutes. So this is our map just depicting where those 6 landscape conservation cooperatives are. You'll see some white space, Texas and Oklahoma, Missouri and Virginia. That doesn't mean that we're not coordinating with those folks. It just means that those areas that are covered by different landscape conservation cooperatives haven't been as fully engaged. But as I'll show at the end of the presentation, we do have some emerging opportunities to expand that reach. So the visions. People ask me if you had to boil down SECAS to one thing, I think it really is a vision. We want to see a connected network of landscapes and seascapes that support those fish and wildlife resources that we're all working to protect. The fish and wildlife resources and all of the benefits that the protection, restoration of those areas provides as well. And so this is really about coordinating those conservation actions and investments to focus on those common goals. So all of those pressures that we mentioned earlier, they also provide an opportunity for the conservation community to focus those efforts on where the best opportunities are to protect those areas and to make sure that we don't have fish and wildlife resources that just get the leftovers after everyone else is done. I'm going to touch just quickly on some early accomplishments. I recognize many of the names in the attendee list here, but some of you may be familiar with the Gulf Coast Vulnerability Assessment, which was completed in 2015. This was really the first broad effort where we worked with the 4 landscape conservation cooperatives across the Gulf, so the Gulf Coast Prairie, Gulf Coastal Plains and Ozarks. South Atlantic has this little a little piece in the Big Bend area of Florida, and then Peninsular Florida LCC. And we developed the Gulf Coast Vulnerability Assessment that really looked at 4 habitats and 11 species and their relative vulnerability. So these are the 4 ecosystems we looked at: barrier islands, tidal emergent marsh, oyster reefs, and mangroves. And then we also looked at the vulnerability of a suite of species within each of those. So this was completed, as I mentioned, in 2015, and it utilized the capacity of about 58 or 59 experts across the Gulf who provided information to let us assess the vulnerability of these systems and species. I'd strongly encourage you to take a look at project pages on the 4 LCCs in the Gulf. This is available, or you can contact one of us. Skipping ahead now, I want to talk a little bit about the SECAS Leadership Summit that we had last fall at the SIAFO meeting in Baton Rouge. It was our 5-year anniversary of the effort, and we really wanted to take the opportunity to celebrate sort of the success that we've had to date and provide some additional excitement about the effort. We unveiled the SECAS Blueprint version 1.0, which I'm going to turn this over to Rua in a few minutes to talk about. And we also wanted to sort of reaffirm our continued engagement from the state agencies as well as the federal agencies in that leadership role. And there's some good accomplishments. So we also highlighted 6 use cases that really put sort of some meat on the bones, so to speak, of tangible products that were already in use. I'm going to show just a couple pictures. We were standing room only. We had 2 different sessions, one that focused on the state and federal leadership, and then that's Ed Carter giving his overview. And then we also had a broader one that focused on a much broader audiences. So we had 2 hours of this 4-hour session focused on why SECAS, and the last couple hours focused on how we were going to get it done. So that's Rua talking about the blueprint, which I'm going to turn it over to him in just a second. I wanted to show you one quote. One of the things we try to do is to get stories or make sure that we're providing useful information and tools that people are actually using. So this quote's from Susan Gibson in the Department of Defense. Susan is a representative on that Southeast Natural Resource Leadership Group. And this is a quote that she gave us following the summit, kind of highlighting the tremendous partnership and the amount of interest in the effort, talking about the blueprint and how that can help them work across the Southeast and identify areas where they can maybe manage differently or expand their reach, and a platform for trust between partners. And this was really emphasized at the summit as well, that we need to have that trust among partnerships, especially as we broaden our reach into industry and private landowners. That's going to be increasingly important. So now I'm going to turn it over to Rua. He's going to talk to you a little bit more specifically about the blueprint.
All right, hello everybody. I'm going to go take my screen here. A second. So now I'm going to talk in a little bit more detail about the blueprint itself and how it came together. So the SECAS blueprint is basically this living map showing shared priorities for conservation and restoration. And what it's doing is it's pulling in the equivalent blueprints from LCCs covering the South. So that's the main cooperatives that you saw already on the map, and also pulling in information to try to fill in some of those gaps up in Virginia and up in Missouri and some of those other components. And so what got released last fall was a sort of a version 1.0. So not surprisingly, there's plenty of room for improvement, but this was the initial version of how we might be able to piece together these individual blueprints and come up with something seamless. So if you just spent 0 time in styling and coloring and just downloaded the individual layers from each of these different blueprints used in 1.0, it looks like a pretty big mess, right? So this takes a little bit of additional effort to think about how you put the pieces together, how you might style it, and how to integrate these different layers. So that's what we were doing over the last year. Way we decided how to integrate this stuff, the first part was the staff of each of the cooperatives just developing some integration options, just based on discussions with folks, lessons learned from previous efforts, where before we had SECAS when we tried to integrate, South Atlantic and Peninsular Florida for particular purposes, or some of these other examples. Took some of those lessons learned, came up with a few different options for how we might logically put it together for a first cut. And there are 2 big remaining questions that came out of this. First off, the sort of how much to include, and each of the cooperatives have different priority levels and sort of percentages covered by the landscape. So how much priority gets in this SECAS blueprint, and then what to do about overlap zones. We got a number of zones where the plans from each cooperative actually overlap with each other, which is great for thinking about how to stitch things together and playing off the strengths of each. But then it's a challenge, because then you have this question, well, what do you do in the overlap zones? And so these were great questions to then bring to the Southeast Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies and the Southeast Natural Resource Leadership Group points of contact to get those points of contact on the phone, run them through a few different options and the trade-offs, and have them make a consensus decision on what we should do for version 1. And so here's the integration approach. This is what they decided on. The first part was to crosswalk each LCC blueprint to get areas of high and medium ecological value. So some of these have more detailed classes, but we could at least get sort of a high and medium class from everything. And the high priority was about 30% of the cooperative, and the medium was an additional 20%. So 30% comes from the literature and some discussions about how much is doable in a rapidly changing landscape, and then you're adding in the medium priority, and that's where a lot of the restoration opportunities and other pieces come about. That fits in a little bit more with the sort of broader half-Earth kind of approach. So that was the first thing. Let's just crosswalk them all and get them in similar. Now I say about 30%. It's close, but it's not exact. But roughly that's what we're shooting for. And then the decision from the group for areas of overlap was to include it if either plan identified it. So if it was in one blueprint or another in an overlap zone, it made it in. And so that was sort of the most conservative approach. In that way, folks felt most comfortable with that approach for the area of overlap. So when you get these overlap zones, it's in there if either plan identifies it. Luckily, there was a lot of overlap when you put these plans together, where they lined up pretty well in most places, which was good to see, actually, better than I thought they were going to line up, which is good news. And the plan is to revisit this approach during the next revision. So we're in the next revision now, and so there'll be another updated version coming in the fall CIAFO meeting. So this is the approach now. We'll take a look at that, see if that's the approach into the future. So here is version 1. Actually, there's a prettier, even more cleaned up version of this, but this will give you the rough idea of the version 1. So the darkest blue is your kind of high conservation value. The lighter blue is the medium, the priority perspective. So when you step back, a couple things to note. Actually, one particular thing that comes up a lot is the marine environment. You'll notice the South Atlantic is the only cooperative that really does the prioritization. It has a blueprint that goes out into the marine environment. And so the other cooperatives have not quite gone there yet. I think Peninsular Florida is on track to do that in the next year or two. We'll see how that goes. And so this map may include a little bit more of the marine environment as we move along. And you'll also see that we filled in some of these other pieces with some other priorities from the LCCs that are not part of those core 6. All right, so that's a lot, right? You take a look at that and you go, wow, that's a whole lot of priority. How do we narrow that down for specific cases? So here's an example, a specific real-world example that came up a few years ago when we were working with North Carolina NRCS, and they wanted to use the South Atlantic Conservation Blueprint for prioritizing, looking and using that in their state rankings for things like EQUIP and a few of their programs. And the challenge we ran into is that if they're going to be part of the state rankings, we actually needed something that covered the entire state. So we didn't quite have that at that point, but now we can actually start looking at more full state and full regional level pieces. So if we were going to talk about, state level stuff related to economic incentives, here's the full blueprint. Let's maybe say pull out the existing protected areas when we're looking at potential economic incentives, and then now let's reduce that even further to look at incentives on cropland. And so now you have a much smaller, much more manageable piece, just with a few simple filters based on the decision and question you're looking at. So that's a simple example of narrowing it down based on specific decisions. Not surprisingly, number of caveats so far, particularly as we're connecting across these different blueprints at different levels of development. The first one, those areas in blue don't represent exactly the same thing in each blueprint. So they're all areas of high conservation value, but there are some tweaked methods, and but there are also some data sets that are consistently used. Some things that go across a number of boundaries, CNC terrestrial resilience, approaches to riparian buffers, those kind of things. Specific outcomes aren't defined for all the individual blue areas. So we don't exactly have models across the whole geography of what would happen if you did something specific. So, if we did protection, if we did specific management, if we did restoration in this place, how is that connected with the outcomes, the indicators themselves? We do have models for some ecosystems in some places. So we can do that in parts of the blueprint, but we can't do it for all of the blueprint yet. Another thing, the blueprint's constantly evolving, so we've committed now to update this annually as the new plans come together. So for those of you looking at the South Atlantic Conservation Blueprint, or even Appalachian, or some of these new pieces coming, the new version of South Atlantic Blueprint 2.2, when it's final, will get wrapped into the next version of the blueprint. And same thing for all the other blueprints for each cooperative. Future threats are only included in some portions of the blueprint. So some of them haven't quite figured out the way they're going to do. Generally, a pattern for a lot of these things is the the more eastern part of the SECAS blueprint is a little further along than the more western parts, just as a sort of a general rule. So there are some components that aren't fully incorporated. In general, the blueprint's providing value as a more regional-wide perspective when we need to cut across big areas and multiple states. Might need to zoom in specific areas, especially maybe even going to the specifics of each individual blueprint for depending on what scale you're looking at. And the last one is there's been a whole bunch of work so far, whole lot of different folks involved for each of these processes. And we've been taking a bottom-up approach, which is kind of messy. You know, you can account for the unique ecosystems and unique things going on in each cooperative. But you know, it is a little bit messier than doing one consistent approach across the whole piece. So it's a little more doable because of the process, but there's plenty of room for improvement. Those are some big caveats to this version. Next steps on the blueprint. So there's more information, including GIS data and metadata, now available. So up on the SECAS Southeast site under Blueprint, under the picture of the map, there's a link that you can kind of download the data and investigate and use it however you want. The highest priority for the next update is going to be things like identifying priorities for action in the next 10 years in the face of future change, and improving consistency in methods and approaches. So, you know, across metrics, across approaches, across the region, working on improving the consistency across each of these blueprints. And the update we have planned to be released for the fall 2017 CIAFWA meeting. So whatever updates are happening pre that time, we'll be folding that into the next iteration of the SECAS blueprint. And that is all I have on the blueprint. I can hand it back to you, Cynthia.
Sure, thank you.
Or maybe someone else. There you go.
Got it. Sorry.
I don't have power.
All right, thanks, Rua, for that. I want to move back quickly to, as I mentioned at the summit last fall in Baton Rouge, we went through much of what Rua just covered on the blueprint. We also, one of the things that the state directors wanted to see were some use cases. So we provided 6 sort of use cases of where the blueprint at various scales were being used to affect on the ground conservation. Because of time today, I'm going to touch on the one that we covered last fall, and then highlight a couple other emerging ones also. So one of the things that the South Atlantic blueprint was used for last year was to bring in new resources through resilient landscapes and fires. So at the summit last fall, Mike Edker of the Fish and Wildlife Service explained how the blueprint was used to attract new money to expand prescribed burning on state, federal, and private lands in the Southeast. And the blueprint was used to basically to demonstrate how wide-range planning is important and can attract resources. Now, much of the funding to date for this prescribed burn is actually spent in the western states, and so to have some of that money be attracted to the Southeast to help us with burning was a real conservation success in that area. I was recently in Oklahoma and presented at the Natural Resource Conference there, and I wanted to highlight some of the work that they're doing. Given where we're at with many of the state wildlife action plans in the Southeast, there's some real opportunity to make sure that those state conservation strategies, that the values that they want to see for fish and wildlife in the state level are reflected in the blueprint, and how can we then also go beyond those state lines to address species that obviously don't abide by geopolitical boundaries. So there's some emerging opportunities in the state wildlife action plans, and working with the Wildlife Diversity Committee of CIAFWA. This was also presented at the recent Oklahoma meeting, looking at some of the ecological systems and the important base layers of data that are used to identify identify those priority areas in the blueprint that Rua mentioned. So this is being led by Dave Diamond and Lee Elliott, Alan Janis, Dwayne German, and Amy Churkeen out of Texas, and then Bruce Hoagland also out of Oklahoma. So this is looking at making sure there's consistent data across those state lines on landscape coverage. So that's emerging as well. So moving into what's next. We want to continue to improve the blueprint. As Rua mentioned, there's some important issues that we want to address here in the next year and then over the next number of years. The science coordinators are going to be meeting soon to work on that. One of the funded projects under the Southeast Climate Science Center is called Vital Futures. That's being led by Bruce Stein for the National Wildlife Federation and Kirsten Dow out of South Carolina. And they're looking at how climate change has been addressed in the state wildlife action plans and also some emerging scenarios for climate change that we can use then to fill in some of what Rua mentioned, that future conditions. So this is a project that's looking at the SECAS-wide area and some of those future conditions. Next week, we've got what we call our SECAS lead coordination team meeting, which in this particular meeting includes the science coordinators and coordinators of those 6 LCCs, plus new coordinator Kelly Myers out of the Eastern Tallgrass Prairies Big River LCC. We've got additional folks from AFWA attending, as well as from the Northeast area, and we're getting together in Raleigh next week to really talk about what our work plan is for the next year, including the science coordinators really trying to get their heads around how to address some of those issues that Rua mentioned. Because we're a state director-driven entity, so to speak, we will be attending this spring directors meeting in April to update them on a couple of the motions that came out of the meeting last fall, and I'll get to those in a minute. And then, of course, and as Rua mentioned, we made a commitment to update the blueprint every year, and that will again this year be done at the CAFWA conference in late October in Louisville, Kentucky. So just following up quickly, and I won't read these, but following the summit last year, the state directors made 2 motions in their business meeting. One was to continue to work with the LCCs and ensure that state priorities continue to be reflected in that blueprint. And again, that's things like the State Wildlife Action Plan or priority species and issues. And so we're continuing to work on that. And then the other thing we wanted to do was evaluate the effectiveness of our sort of how the SECAS family is structured and bring forward some recommendations for improvement. So we'll be doing that at the April meeting as well. Following up on that leadership, the federal side, they made a similar motion at their meeting in January to continue to ensure that the federal agencies' interests are reflected in future iterations of the blueprint and make sure that there's that support from the federal agencies to continue to be engaged in this effort at the LCC level and SECAS-wide as well. So a couple opportunities to get engaged. Several of the LCCs are doing blueprint workshops. The South Atlantic is just getting underway with their newest round of blueprint workshops next week. The Gulf Coastal Plains and Ozarks Science Coordinator Todd Jones-Frand is meeting with various partners across his geography here in this spring. The Gulf Coast Prairie is just getting underway with a landscape design project there. And then, of course, Peninsular Florida is hosting workshops, and the Appalachian has had some recent workshops as well. So those are all opportunities to get engaged. I encourage you to check out the website. I'll show the SECAS website address in a minute, but also the individual LCCs. They send out great newsletters, have a lot of information about upcoming opportunities and webinars, and when data or information is updated on the Conservation Planning Atlas as well. Same for the Southeast Aquatic Resources Partnership. They have a great newsletter as well, and are also in the midst of busily talking about the Southeast Aquatic Resource Partnership at things like at various fisheries societies. And then also the Climate Science Center, if you have an opportunity to get engaged with some of those projects as well. So I just want to quickly touch on connecting up with other regional efforts. You'll see in the Blueprint version 1.0 that Rua showed that there is coverage in the Northeast and the state of Missouri. And so one of the things we want to make sure we continue to do is work closely with the Northeast Regional Conservation Framework, some of their landscape design efforts. There is an emerging opportunity in the Midwest with both the Mississippi River Gulf Hypoxia Initiative that's being spearheaded by the Eastern Tallgrass Prairies Big Rivers LCC, Gwen White and Kelly Myers, and then potentially expanding that into an even bigger emerging Midwestern effort. So we've also, one of our coordinators, Mallory Martin, spoke at the Midwest Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies meeting last fall as well. There's also been Cindy Donor, who is our liaison to the federal agencies at a Fish and Wildlife Service in Atlanta, has presented to the Western Governors Association, and we've had some good interest from the West to kind of expand this concept beyond Texas and Oklahoma as well. So there's lots of information out there. Rua mentioned the SECASSoutheast.org website has got a lot of information on the blueprint, as well as some of the use cases in a great story map that we put together. The actual data layers are available on the Southeast Region Conservation Planning Atlas. If you want to get regular updates, you can let me know. I kind of update a emerging list of individuals on kind of what we're up to every month. And then that's my contact information. If after today you have additional questions or you want additional information, don't hesitate to contact me. I'm more than happy to chat with you about SECAS. And Hillary, that was all I had. This is our landscape conservation cooperative crew, so to speak, after the summit last fall in Baton Rouge. So I'll turn it back to you, Hillary.
All right, thanks, Cynthia. Thanks to you too, Rua. It was a great presentation. I'd say we have probably 10 or 15 minutes for questions, so plenty of time for a good Q&A here. Greg, did any questions pop up in the question box that you want to go ahead and run with?
Well, nobody has sent me any written questions yet, but I would just encourage people now, if you have questions, you could either put it in the question box or you could raise your hand. There's a little raise hand function that you should see available to you, and we will try and unmute you so that you can ask your question directly. So we have the usual bashful silence. I'm sure somebody must have a question.
Don't be shy. Someone's got to break the ice here.
Okay, Chuck Rowe. I'm going to try and unmute. Are you there, Chuck?
I was experimenting, so I'm on the spot. A question about how far you have gone in defining conservation, the implementation. Last week or so at the annual Biodiversity Days conference in Durham, E.O. Wilson was asked at the end of his address if he had a personal definition of what qualified as protected land, and he did not. He punted to the next generation of us conservationists to determine our definition of success. So is that that basic question something SECAS is considering?
Yeah, this is Cynthia. I'll maybe take a crack at that, and then Rua can correct me. So conservation in terms of both restoration, management, and protection is addressed a little bit differently in each of the 6 landscape conservation cooperatives. Some of those high priority areas are focused on existing areas that are in either good shape or have the potential to be restored or managed differently. And in others, there's a focus on both more equally, I guess, the conservation and for the protection of existing areas and the additional restoration potential. So I think it varies a little bit among LCCs, and that gets to one of the things that Rua brought up that we need to focus on in the next year and beyond is the methods that are used to identify those areas need to be, we want to work on the consistency of those. Because each of the LCCs are self-directed partnerships, there has been a little bit of difference in those priorities.
I would say to build on to that, the big question that you're kind of asking, Chuck, is that I think is exactly the whole idea of having one of these big shared strategies is, defining what does success look like? What is, what are we shooting for collectively? How do we make sure we're on track? How do we get there? Setting some doable, and I mentioned that before, the sort of priorities for action in the next 10 years. Where do we need to be? What are we shooting for? How do we make sure we're on track? So there are some differences in, small, I would say mostly pretty small differences in flavors and technical details of how you pick out what are restoration zones versus, incentives versus et cetera across the plans, just as Cynthia said. So there are some, some technical details, but from what I've seen in all of them and from what I understand all of the cooperatives, the bigger intent, the bigger thinking about conservation is that full portfolio of actions, particularly including, incentives and other components. I think they're thought about fairly similar, and a lot of the differences are more in the technical ability for defining them. But in general, I think this is a great vehicle to think of the South, the level of the South, and say, what does success look like, and are we getting there, and what do we need to do to get there?
In the South Atlantic, Chuck, we often refer back to the open standards for conservation action taxonomy, which includes not just conservation easements and fee title protection, but management, but restoration, livelihood and economic incentives, even policy that might help direct smart growth practices in an urban area. So we think of all of those actions as being on the table.
Good, thank you. I'll continue the conversation with some of you next Tuesday at your Blueprint workshop.
Great, we'll see you then. Thanks, Chuck. Any other questions?
Yeah, I think we have one here from Rick Durbrow. We also have one from Susan Rupp, but it's about contact information that we can follow up at the end of the webinar or afterwards. But Rick, I'm going to unmute you. Would you like to ask your question? Are you there?
Yeah, I'm trying to make sure I press unmute. I don't have my glasses on. I've got actually a couple of people here, and I'm going to let them ask their own questions.
Okay. Christine McKay, Water Protection Division here at EPA Region 4. I was just curious if you have a communication outreach strategy for local governments.
So this is Cynthia. I'll take a crack at that. We actually are working on an outreach strategy, and that's going to be one of the focuses of that lead coordination team meeting that I mentioned that's going on next week. There's been some additional capacity added to our team in the last little while, and we want to really move on that engagement strategy. And local governments is certainly a topic that was discussed at the summit last fall. So not yet, but that is emerging as it's going to continue to be an area of focus, especially in the next sort of 12 to 18 months.
And I might also add, in the South Atlantic, sometimes individual LCCs are taking steps to engage with local government more below that SECAS umbrella. We've been working in the South Atlantic on a project with the American Planning Association to improve the South Atlantic Conservation Blueprint in and around urban areas, and part of that was a urban conservation summit that we held in Atlanta last fall that turned out about 20 different local county planners and water resource professionals to help get that conversation started. So we definitely have a lot of room to grow in that area, and it's a focus for improving our blueprint and improving the diversity of our cooperative community going forward, but we're starting to kind of bite off that piece.
And this is Rick, and I just wanted to mention that the EPA has put together an internal communications outreach effort that's going to actually work through the other Southeast Natural Resource Leaders Group agencies to be able to coordinate our activities and get input to support SECAS over the next 8 to 18 months.
Great.
So is that it for the Rick Dubrow end?
You know I always have more questions.
We did have one other person.
I'll hold all mine until next week.
Okay.
We're allowed to use Rick because he's on our steering committee. So.
Thank you. So we have a question from Tim Jones, and he just has his hand raised, so I'm going to unmute Tim Jones. Are you there?
If you can hear me, I am.
Yes.
So, Rua, is there any intent of ever letting us drill down to understand how these priorities will affect the individual indicators that you put into the blueprint?
I love that you asked that question, Tim, because we're actually working on that at 2 different levels. So, you know, each cooperative is working on those pieces. So we have some different layers for drilling in. And actually, if you want to follow up, we can talk more on how to do it with the South Atlantic data. But the other component that is actually going to be part of the discussion at this upcoming SECAS meeting next week is, amongst the sort of science coordinators breakout, is we're going to be talking about how to do this for the full SECAS blueprint as well. So how do you pull, when you've got sort of multiple cooperatives with some different methods and different pieces, how do you peel back and go at a pixel or catchment or subwatershed, click on that, and then see, okay, why are these areas a priority? What's going into it? In some cases, it might be from multiple cooperatives and things like that. So that's one of the things we're going to be working with from an access perspective of how you drill down into some of the whys of those different pixels. So that is a very high priority to work on. Of course, that's the first, it's like, oh, okay, that's great. I see that this data went in here. I see that this happened, but okay, now that I look at this individual place, why is this a high priority given all the different things? Or if I care about, the ones that are best for birds or the ones that are best for these different resources, you want to be able to pull those out. So yes, that's super important.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. The easiest way to do that now in the South Atlantic is probably to download all of the data layers and just kind of play with looking at which indicators score highly in an area that you're particularly interested in. But as Rua said, getting that into our interfaces in a really user-friendly way has been a little trickier, and it's a very high priority for us to crack that nut in the next couple years.
Okay, well, right now the last question that we have outstanding is from Susan Rupp, so I'm going to unmute Susan. Are you there?
I am. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I just actually typed into the chat box that last question was addressing exactly part of the reason I wanted to figure out if there were any ways of getting in touch with the individual state collaborators that have been part of the SECAS blueprint. So that last question kind of addressed my question.
Yeah, and I think the best way to do that, maybe, Susan, is to work through the LCCs that you're most interested in. So if it's the Gulf Coast Prairie or the Gulf Coastal Plains and Ozarks, both of which are in areas that I know you work in. So it might be best to work through those folks.
Okay, great. I can follow up with you then. Thank you.
Yeah, you can. Yeah, contact me, Susan.
Anything else? We still have a little time, so if you have other questions, feel free.
Let's see. Rick Dubrow, did you raise your hand again, or? I guess not. You didn't. Right now, well, no. Here's one. Mary Long has a question. Mary, you're unmuted.
Yeah, hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I'm curious if this is filtering down beyond the state level. There's a number of very large regional planning efforts going on across the Southeast that really is being initiated more by municipalities. Is there any discussion between SECAS and these particular planning efforts that you're aware of?
Could you give a
Or
little
even
more
with the
detail on
LCC?
what planning efforts?
Well, for example, the Knoxville Regional Metropolitan Area is doing a planning effort through 2040. And I'm curious if efforts like that encompass large areas of different states are at all engaged with the LCCs or with something like SECAS. So is this actually filtering? I'm sorry?
Oh, I was saying I think Knoxville would probably, are they in the Appalachian? I was wondering if anyone in the App LCC was on to maybe take that. But.
Yeah, I don't think there's anyone from the App LCC on, but I guess and I'm not familiar with that one in particular, but there are certainly regional planning efforts depending on the LCCs and the engagement. Those are being included and identified. That's one of the reasons we want to continue to do sort of outreach and to additional groups, is to make sure we can get as much of that included as we can.
So how would that work by the state getting involved with the regional planning efforts, the metropolitan regional planning efforts? Again, it's that thing of having this broad course strategy and really bringing it down to the effort at the more local level.
Yeah, and I think that following up on the earlier question about the engagement of local governments, that's certainly been identified as one of the target groups, I guess, that we need to reach out to more. I know in addition to the examples that Hillary mentioned earlier, there's some work going on in the Chenier Plain of Texas and Louisiana, for example, with those sort of local authorities and local governments as well. So I would say that that's coming. And again, I think the best opportunity is to work through the specific LCC and their coordinators and science coordinators or additional staff like Hillary. So
yeah, this is
and
go ahead, Cynthia.
I just wanted to also mention that on the SECAS website, the secassoutheast.org, there all our contact information is there, as well as lists of existing state and federal partners and representatives too.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah, I would add one quick thing on that. Hi, Mary. This is Rua. So yeah, what in our experience so far in the South Atlantic has been, you know, when we've worked on a few specific, I mean, around here in some of the triangle area of counties and municipalities, and kind of looking to make some progress around Tallahassee and Atlanta and some other regional planning efforts. You know, it's kind of been a combination where, you know, you have, as long as you've got connections with some of the key folks that the local planners are already going to be working with, and the data works well enough in that municipality area, then we have some opportunities. But I think there's still a long way to go of bringing down, you know, in some cases the course level stuff can be helpful, but I think it's probably going to take a few years of growing together and learning to make this bigger blueprint detailed enough to be as useful in those local pieces. But we're starting to get a few case studies where we're making some progress, and you'll find, in fact, that specific example of state folks, North Carolina has their Green Growth Toolbox, where they have staff and work with municipalities for helping them do smart growth and green planning. And they do actually use the South Atlantic Conservation Blueprint, which is part of the SECAS Blueprint, as one of the planning resources that they provide and mention in their documents. So it is getting into the arsenal of some folks that are working more closely with the some of the municipalities. But it is, I think it's definitely a work in progress. There are some connections and some opportunities, but I think it's going to take a little bit of growing together and improvements before it becomes a major player in some of these plans. And in particular, I think these multi-county plans are where it shines the most.
Thanks, Rua. So we've got about 5 minutes till we're at the hour, so I think I'm going to proceed just with a quick preview of next month's web forum and some updates from LCC staff. Next month, we're going to be hearing from Dr. Tom Allen, who's with Old Dominion University, was formerly with East Carolina University. This is maybe a little bit more of a traditional South Atlantic web forum setup, but if you're interested in marshes, I would definitely encourage you to tune in, definitely even if you're outside of the South Atlantic geography. He's going to be talking about the results of a project that was funded by the South Atlantic LCC to develop high and low marsh maps for the entire geography. So he's going to give a recap of the thematic classification scheme that was developed to map high versus low marsh. He's going to cover the object-based image analysis methods, the results of the accuracy assessment, and the final format of raster versus vector marsh map products. So he's going to highlight how the Landsat 8 OLI can be useful for monitoring salt marshes and introduce a suite of normalized difference multispectral indices to accompany the maps. So that's what we have to look forward to next month. Hope that you'll join us on the 20th of April. And some updates from LCC staff. Registration is still open for the South Atlantic LCC's Blueprint workshops, which you heard Chuck Rowe mention that he's going to be coming to the one next week in Chapel Hill. Registration, we've gone ahead and closed for Chapel Hill just because it's a few days out, but if you do still think you might be interested in coming to Chapel Hill, I just ask that you email me directly and we could try to accommodate you. Hope that many of you can join us for a workshop. The dates and locations are here, and you can learn more about it on this Blueprint Workshop webpage on the South Atlantic's website. And then we do have Draft Blueprint 2.2 ready for review on the Conservation Planning Atlas here in the South Atlantic. You can find all of the layers that were used to produce the blueprint on the Blueprint 2.2 data gallery on the Conservation Planning Atlas. So that's indicators, corridors, the ecosystem prioritizations, and the blueprint itself. And of course, this is one of the things that you'll be doing at the workshops. If you do come in the morning, you'll be reviewing Draft Blueprint 2.2. But if you can't come to a workshop, you can also share your input on a little online comment form that you can find on Rua's blog about the Draft Blueprint, and that's on the homepage of the South Atlantic website. And then we also have a webinar coming up in the Gulf Coastal Plains and Ozarks LCC. Greg?
Yes, we have a tentative date, which is May 4th at 1 p.m., but I haven't quite pinned that down yet. But this is to present the second half of a quite extensive ecosystem services project that covered 4 different subgeographies in the GCPO, and we already had one section presented, and this second webinar will be looking at survey results of landowners and how they view their land, why they own land, what their concerns are, and willingness to pay for a certain select subset of services, as well as an intriguing network analysis looking at how conservation providers and program staff relate or do not relate to each other within the region. So please check our website for details on that.
Thanks, Greg. So last slide, I always like to wrap up with how to get more involved in your cooperative. I'd encourage you to join the South Atlantic LCC web community by signing up on the website. That'll get you added to our monthly newsletter and a monthly reminder about this web forum. You can always connect with your staff or with other members of your cooperative, and then of course we'd encourage you to explore the Conservation Blueprint online. And Cynthia gave a lot of great other next steps for getting more involved and learning more about SECAS as well. We will post the recording of this webinar and the slides on the South Atlantic LCC website on the calendar event, and I think it'll probably go out with a follow-up email from Greg for anyone who was registered for this web forum as well. So unless there are any other questions or comments, I think we'll wrap up. It's 11 o'clock here in Raleigh. Thank you so much for joining us.